Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, I'm going to be looking back at the last 10 years in terms of ex-Jehovah's Witness activism. How has ex-Jehovah's Witness activism changed in the last 10 years? It turns out I'm now in a position to do this because I've been doing activism for that period. I mean, my official anniversary, I guess you'd call it, I regard as October. It was October the 4th, 2011, when JW Survey was launched. We now call it JW Watch, of course. But I was doing, I guess, activism in the months leading up to that. For example, it was August 7th, 2011, when I started posting on XJW forums, and it was September 30th when I did my first blog post. It was on someone else's website at the time, but nevertheless, I was getting involved in activism 10 years ago, and that perhaps puts me in a position that not all ex-Jehovah's Witnesses are in, of being able to, again, look back at this period and think about how activism has changed from when I first burst onto the scene as a much younger, much more naive ex-Jehovah's Witness, with so much to learn, just trying to make his voice heard. Well, one thing that I've noticed is different 10 years on, is that ex-Jehovah's Witness activism in general is more secular, or leans in a more secular direction. When I first got involved in activism 10 years ago, I would say activism was leaning more in a theist direction, or more from the point of view of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who wanted to remain Christians, which is totally fine, by the way. It just felt at the time as though atheism was far more taboo. If people were talking about whether God actually existed or whether the Bible was in fact God's inspired word, it was, I guess, considered quite a taboo topic. And in fact, one of my earliest blog posts, because I started blogging for someone else's website, and that collaboration ended because I wrote a blog article that wasn't openly atheist, but was at least asking questions about the Bible and about the Bible narrative, and to what extent the traditional interpretation of the Bible narrative could be taken seriously. So that's a world away from where we are now, where it feels almost as though the opposite is true, and really, I think the majority probably lean more towards atheism and not being religious, just abandoning the project of religion altogether, which I obviously, as an atheist, consider to be quite a well-justified position to take. But I can understand why it would be alarming to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who still identify as Christians. I'm sure they won't be very comforted to see that change happen in the last 10 years. But for me, that's definitely something that's changed. I would say that probably if you were to poll ex-Jehovah's Witnesses now, it would look something like 60% non-religious or atheist and 40% Christian. So that's one change that I've noticed. Another change has been the increasing media exposure since I first got involved in activism. In fact, I can vividly remember being involved in an article in The Independent, again, right at the beginning of my activism. I've just looked up the article, and sadly it's behind a paywall, but you can access it, I suppose. It is at least possible to read it if you subscribe to The Independent. But the article is titled "War of Words Breaks Out Among Jehovah's Witnesses," subheading "Attack on Mentally Diseased Worshippers Who Leave Church Provokes Outcry." It's by Jerome Taylor, and it's dated Monday, 31st of August, 2011. So were coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that article, I was involved in this, and I think they referred to me as John, because at the time, bear in mind, I was still sort of PMO. I was doing my work undercover. I didn't want my elders at that time to know who I was. So my activism was being done behind this pseudonym of John Cedars. And I can remember being involved in this article and obviously working with the journalist who put it together. It was in reaction to the July 15th, 2011 Watchtower that infamously referred to apostates and former witnesses as being mentally diseased. And I can remember being on the forum and people reacting about it. And one person in particular, I forget exactly how they put it, but they said something like, "You don't understand, Cedars. This is big. This is bigger than what we're used to." I forget exactly how they put it, but the response among ex-Jehovah's Witnesses was, wow, a newspaper like The Independent is covering shunning, is covering ex-Jehovah's Witness stories. And this was like a massive deal in the community at that time. Nowadays, I would suggest that it's almost expected for there to be at least some media exposure at some point during the year, usually to do with child sexual abuse cover-up, justifiably, but certainly something about the abusive leanings of the organisation. We expect the media to keep tabs on things. Back in 2011, it was very much a surprise for there to be this level of exposure. So definitely in the 10 years that I've been doing activism, media exposure has become more something that we can expect rather than something that comes only once in a blue moon. Another change that I've noticed in the last 10 years of ex-Jehovah's Witness activism is the preponderance of ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube channels. Now, obviously, 10 years ago, there were ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube channels. I would just suggest that there weren't as many. You certainly weren't seeing 10 years ago the number of channels that we see today and the diversity of YouTube ex-Jehovah's Witness activists. Today, it's wonderful to see so many different YouTube activists from so many different backgrounds, with so many different stories, so that so many different lives can be represented. People can go on YouTube as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and invariably find a YouTuber that they can identify with, because we have YouTube activists who are women, we have YouTube activists who are LGBTQ+, we have YouTube activists that are persons of colour, we have YouTube activists that are white. In other words, there's a broad spectrum of YouTube ex-Jehovah's Witness activists, and that is wonderful. That's not to say that it was only guys doing YouTube channels 10 years ago, or only white people doing ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube channels 10 years ago. It's just there are far more channels now and far more different voices being represented that different people can relate to. And that is absolutely wonderful. Long may this increase, this wondrous increase in YouTube ex-Jehovah's Witness activism continue. I want to see more and more channels moving forward, because as I've long said, if you only have like one or two voices, those are the only perspectives you're going to hear. Just because I have an opinion on something doesn't mean that's the only opinion. Everyone's different, and everyone's going to look at a given subject or a given video or a given Watchtower article in a slightly different way. So the more ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube activists we have, the more people will be able to find something that they can relate to in ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube activism. And still on YouTube, another change that I've noticed in 10 years of doing this is that YouTube channels grow more quickly. It took me an eternity to get to my first 10,000 subscribers. I forget exactly how long, but it was years. And when you look at YouTube channels today, they grow far more quickly. I think Harrison Kotha, The Truth Hurts, is already on, is it 30,000 plus subscribers? Yes, as I'm making this video, that's roughly how many subscribers he has. Now, bear in mind, Harrison's videos are incredibly well researched. He puts a lot of time and effort into his content, time and effort that perhaps other YouTubers, other ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTubers won't be able to devote to their videos. Nonetheless, for a YouTube activist like Harrison to grow his channel so quickly, that would have been unheard of 10 years ago. It just didn't happen that way, because I think the audience for ex-Jehovah's Witness content on YouTube 10 years ago was much, much smaller. Nowadays, there's a much bigger audience. There are far more people who consume this sort of content, and that's inevitably had an impact on how quickly channels grow. And it's wonderful to see, in the case of Harrison and other YouTubers, that their channels are ballooning in size much more quickly than it took my channel to grow all those years ago. Another thing that I've noticed over the last 10 years, and this sort of relates to YouTube, is the fact that there's quite frankly more to talk about, thanks in large part to JW Broadcasting. Bear in mind, JW Broadcasting is still a relatively recent development. So I started my activism in 2011. The first JW Broadcasting episode went out in October 2014. I can still vividly remember watching that very first episode and thinking, wow, I can't believe they've made this rookie mistake of showing everybody who the governing body are. Because up to that point, I'd been desperately trying to do that in my videos. I'd been scrambling together any audio recordings I could find of, say, Tony Morris or Stephen Lett to show just how unimpressive these men are when you shove a microphone in front of them. So for the organization to decide that it was a good thing to produce hour-long episodes hosted by governing body members, this was just a gift to me. I was pinching myself that here I was as an ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTuber wanting to produce visual content, and they were giving me stuff to talk about on a plate. Because it's one thing to play an audio recording, or it's one thing to read a Watchtower article that's just been released. But to be able to show actual HD video of these men talking and of their hateful, narrow-minded, crazy stuff that they're saying, well, that was just a gift. And so that changed everything as far as I'm concerned about ex-Jehovah's Witness activism. And arguably this development alone has helped tremendously in the growth of ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube material, because just as I've benefited from being able to show this awful video propaganda on my channel, so have other ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTubers. And I think that's helped to grow the audience in general. That has helped there to be this ballooning interest in what ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTube activists have to say. So that's a massive difference. Just the sheer increase in things to talk about that this organization has effectively gifted to activists. Another thing I've noticed over the last 10 years is that activists are more vocal on social media. Obviously, social media has grown in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, we had Facebook. I'm pretty sure we had Twitter as well. But they were much smaller platforms, and I would argue less influential platforms 10 years ago than they are today. And nowadays, if you can get a decent following on Facebook or Twitter, you can really put some information out there. And what we're seeing today on Facebook and Twitter is just a flood of information about the negative elements of the Jehovah's Witness religion, which is wonderful to see. I would argue that 10 years ago, it was more a case of having to go on forums to view this information, whereas nowadays it's far more accessible. You have Twitter, you have Facebook, you have Reddit, all the various different incarnations and platforms of social media have made it much, much easier for people to get the information they need about the organization. And obviously, again, ex-Jehovah's Witness activists have been crucial in that. It's one thing to have this availability. It's one thing to have this voice. What you need is ex-Jehovah's Witness activists who are willing to accept the challenge and to put the information out there. So the extent to which social media is being used today is very encouraging. And again, I would argue something different than what was the case 10 years ago, when mostly things were confined to forums. And that's mostly it. There's just one final point I wanted to make when I look back over 10 years of ex-Jehovah's Witness activism, and that's that in general, and I hate generalizing, but in general, I would say that ex-Jehovah's Witness activism is more rounded and balanced than it was 10 years ago. And I don't want to upset or offend anyone, because this touches on the whole issue of how do we do our activism? Is it okay to crash Kingdom Halls? Is it okay to engage in what I call aggressive activism? Back at the beginning, or 10 years ago, I should say, it was very much a case of anything goes. And I can remember vividly around 2014, there reached a point where you couldn't go on Facebook without there just being post after post after post of someone confronting a Jehovah's Witness on the street, or someone going into a Kingdom Hall and causing a scene. And these sorts of posts would be mostly just greeted with, oh yeah, good for you. This is fantastic. We need more of this. And I remember back in 2014, I thought long and hard about it as to whether I could genuinely support that sort of behavior. And I made a video at the time, if Tibor is gracious, it will appear here, about separating myself from what I called aggressive activism. And there was huge blowback. I was subjected to quite a lot of hatred and vitriol, specifically from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who found value in that form of activism. They viewed my video as a betrayal. They viewed my video as essentially scorning what they were doing. That's not why I made the video. My video was purely to say, maybe there's a different way of doing this. And speaking for myself, this is not something I can get behind. If other people need to do it, I'm not the police. I'm not the ex-Jehovah's Witness police, and I don't get to tell people what they should or shouldn't do. It's just that I'm going to have to peace out when it comes to this particular form of activism. Again, it was just a nightmare at the time with how much pushback I got. But I like to think that now in 2021, the views that I was expressing back then are probably shared by the majority of certainly ex-Jehovah's Witness activists. There will always be those who think that anything goes, and as long as you're making your voice heard, it doesn't matter whether you're crashing Kingdom Halls, it doesn't matter whether you're getting into the faces of bewildered Jehovah's Witnesses and confronting them. But I like to think that opinion has now swung more against that sort of behavior, which I actually think is a good thing. Again, that's not to say that I or anyone else gets to police the way ex-Jehovah's Witnesses do their activism, but I think the movement in general benefits from approaching things in a more balanced, rounded way and saying, you know what, we're not so insecure about our position that we need to go confronting people with it. We're happy with the fact that all you need to do is do a few clicks on Google or write a few words into YouTube, and the information is there in abundance when you're ready to look at it. And that's not to say YouTube is the only form of activism or social media is the only form of activism. If you watch my documentary, The Polish Exodus, thumbnail here, if Tibor is gracious, I actually follow activists in Poland who do public demonstrations. And these demonstrations are aimed at informing the public about the harms of the Jehovah's Witness religion. And they've even had some success in doing these demonstrations outside convention venues. So there is merit in this sort of boots on the ground approach to activism. It's just that in my view, it's a very, very fine line, or it can be a very, very fine line between doing it properly and doing it respectfully and allowing emotions to spill over so that Jehovah's Witnesses feel unsafe or they feel confronted. So basically there's balance needed. And I feel when I look back on 10 years of ex-Jehovah's Witness activism, that there is now far more balance and far more sensitivity regarding these sorts of issues than there was to begin with. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, really. Those are my thoughts on how activism has changed over the last 10 years. I hope you found this video interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.